that we could put up, allowing us to map out to turn the dial, right? So then in a chord situation, remember in sheet music, you often don't really have chords. You've got stacks of notes, kind of like a DAW system. So, and that's because classically you might have multiple people playing the song, building a chord up from different instruments and whatnot. But these days you might not have that, or even in a DAW you could still make the chord and assign different instruments to it or something like that. So it would be nice, as with tablature, to be able to represent chords. It's going to be a lot easier to see your sheet music if you can represent the basic chords. Now, when I say basic chords, what I mean is that you should at least be able to represent all chords from any modal perspective, any of the 7 notes in the system. And if you have a chord that has all the notes that are in the collection of 7 notes, those should be available to you, at least in its normal construction, meaning the tonic is the lowest, then the third, then the fifth, and so on and so forth, up in pitch from there. Those chords should be available. And then if you have more complex chords, meaning you have notes that are outside the collection of notes, the 5 notes outside the collection of notes, then that's when you would have to stack, right? You'd have to stack to have those, or you could have a more complex system that adds those more complex chords. And then how could you do that? Well, I'd like to be able to add the chords in such a way that I'm not referring to the notes. So if I'm in the collection of notes around the C major, I don't want to call it a C major chord, because if I call it a C major chord, I can't transpose it automatically, right? What I would have to do then is change it to a D major chord if I want to look at the collection of notes around the D. But if I name the chord by modal point, relative position, the entire thing as I write it is transposable. I just have to tell you which collection of notes I'm in. So in other words, a C major chord is just a 3-note triad built off of the Ionian node. You can write it this way, and the reason I started with an N is because if you're typing this into a system like a MIDI system, if you type a number 3, then that might just be a note number. But if you type an N, then you think you might get a drop down, or the system would know that you're going to try to draw a chord there, and then you'd have a chord. So it's a notes, there's 3 notes, it's an Ionian. You could also call it an Ionian to modal whole step chord. That's just the distance from the Ionian to the last note. You can also make it a capital, which if you're using an Ionian would tell you that that's the tonic. So in other words, you're saying I'm in this collection of notes around the C major, and this one is the tonic. I'm showing you that by showing it's a capital letter here. You could also name it by range, meaning the Ionian chord, if I have a 1, 3, 5, will be a range going from the 1 to the 5, meaning Nashville number 1 to Nashville number 5, the Ionian to the Mixolydian. So in a DAW system, any of these ways to name the chord should be available. I can toggle through, I should be able to say, hey, look, show me the chord in any of these ways that I think I'm most comfortable with. And the system should be able to convert this, if I want to see it with relation to the note, to something like this, which doesn't have the note, allowing me to easily transpose everything to all 12 collections of 7 notes. So notice, so then if I scroll down, this would be a C major 7 or a major 7, right? I can remove the C, and then you have a major 9, major 11, major 13. Lydian then has, you can call it an F major, because that would be the related Lydian, but I'd rather just call it a 3-note Lydian, right? A 4-note Lydian, an F major 9, a major sharp 11, a major 13 sharp 11, remembering that these naming conventions are ugly, whereas these naming conventions are clean. Why are these ugly? Because we're forcing ourselves to use note names and compare it to the major naming convention instead of just saying, this is natural, this is what happens if you build off of the Lydian node. If you build off the Lydian node, just take the intervals from the Lydian node and you don't have to do anything ugly. You just say that's just what happens when you build it off the Lydian node. Just build a 3-note Lydian, a 4-note Lydian, just take every other note, every other modal half step from the Lydian node. and then that will make it not ugly in the naming convention, and it will make it automatically transposable. Same with the Mixolydian. They made up these terms for Mixolydian, G7, G9 instead of G major 7. Again, if you just say, hey, look, it's a 3-note Lydian, a 4-note Lydian, a Mixolydian, a 5-note Mixolydian, then it doesn't get ugly. You don't have to make up things. You just say those are the natural intervals. Just do the natural intervals when you go from the Mixolydian in a normal 7-note chord. And obviously the Aeolian, the Dorian, and then the Phrygian and the Locrian. So I started with the majors first: Ionian, Lydian, Mixolydian, major modes, minor modes, Aeolian, Dorian, Phrygian, and then the Locrian. So that gives, so those, all of those can be mapped out: a 3-note chord by modal point, 4-note chord by modal point, and so on and so forth. Now we are going to end up in a situation, if I want to rotate the chords, then if I write the chord like this, it's a 3-note Ionian, and I want to turn the dial to make it a Dorian, 1 notch up. That I would actually be down here. So that would be a 3-note Dorian. It automatically will snap into place, meaning the Dorian has a minor third. But if you just write the chord, then you just write the chord, right? And the minor third will snap into place, because all I'm saying is the Ionian is now Dorian, right? So it allows you to rotate through the modal positions as well as to transpose. Now, the only problem with that, however, is that if I'm looking at this over here from the perspective of the Dorian, like let's say I map this out and I write my music by relative position, Nashville number. And if I'm in the Ionian, the 1 would be the lowest pitched number. But if I shift it to the Dorian, right? If I shift it to the Dorian, I can change this. So if I go down and change this to the Dorian, now this chord is now a Dorian. That snaps into place beautifully. The Ionian now changed to a 2, which is fine. So I'm still going to use the same numbering system. I'm not going to say, look, I'm in Dorian and now Dorian is the 1. No, I'm going to keep the Dorian the 2. I'm just going to say the 2 is now the tonic. But if I do that, notice that if I put an Ionian, a 1, these 1s over here, pitch-wise, should be higher in pitch than the Dorian. So I have to basically be able to memorize or be able to think that the 2 is now the tonic. If I take into it, it's got the same Nashville numbers, 1 through 7, plus the 0.5s for those 5 numbers in the ocean, what I call in the ocean or out of the key. But from an octave perspective, if the 2 is the tonic, I need to make it the lowest note, right? And so that means that now the lowest note in this column should be D Dorian if we're playing in the relative Dorian to the C major collection. So that's going to be the idea. How could we do that? Well, one way we could do that is I could then look at my numbering system over here. You'll recall that we had up here, we had C going up in pitch in a DAW system going this way. And then we had our numbers, we can number that 1 through 12. And then we had our MIDI numbers, which start at 60 to 71. This is the permanent numbering system for a MIDI system. What I'd like, this is the relative position 1 through 7. So 1, 1.5, 2, 2.53, 4, because there's no 0.5 between 3 and 4, 4.55, 5.56, 6.57. We end up with 5.5s, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because there's 5 notes out of the collection of notes. They're still available to you, but those aren't the ones that are standard in the collection of notes. So if I can see my formula, whole step to a whole number, whole step to a whole number, half step to a whole number, whole step to a whole number, whole step to a whole number, whole step to a whole number, and then it would start over again. This is the local distance, which starts back over at 1. But I can make an absolute relative or Nashville number position, meaning it takes into account octaves. So instead of going from 7 back to 1, as if we're going around in a circle or a clock, it goes to 8, and then 8.5 and 9, and so on and so forth. So now I'm taking into account octaves from the relative perspective of a Nashville number system. So that means that if I'm over here looking at my chords, when I go to a Dorian, I'm gonna need to adjust the Ionian needs to be from an absolute Nashville number system. It needs to be an 8, not a 1. The Ionian needs to be the octave higher when I map it out. So then same thing. So that's what these are all doing. These are mapping out the 1 octave higher as I shift forward through the 7 modes. And so you can take a look at that if you want to get more into the background or detail of that from a coding situation or standpoint. This is going to be my Nashville numbers. Now remember, the Nashville numbers I'm representing them going up now in pitch, as is typically the case in like a DAW type of system. So now we have here, if we start on A, let's start on C, like C is over here. So we have 1 to 2 to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but then the 0.5s, same numbering system we looked at before. So whole step to D, whole step to E, half step to F, whole step to G, whole step to A, whole step to B, meaning this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the collection of notes around the key of C. The ones that have sharps or flats are in the ocean, right? Those are the 5 notes that are not in the collection of notes, still available, but they're going to be listed as the 0.5 notes to indicate that those are the ones that are going to be outside the collection. So you just want to note that, and that's a nice indication if you're actually writing music in a DAW, particularly for those that don't know music well, right? Because then you can easily have the indication, oh, it's a 0.5 note. It's one that's in the ocean. It's outside the collection. Be careful. Make sure you're adding that intentionally. All right. So then this gives us our 12 collections of notes from this perspective. From the perspective. So if I start on an A, whatever, all 12 collections of notes, giving us those collection of notes from the perspective, not of 1 through 12 as relative positions of the notes, but instead as this Nashville number perspective. That allows me the dial. It allows me to shift this perspective from an absolute perspective, gives me the dial to shift. This is the same thing, but it's just using numbers. Now up top, this is just a reference to the cell references that I used in the formulas if you want to get into the Excel to see how to map this out. So all that information then allows us to map this out into what I would call like the sheet music kind of situation. So even if you're doing it by hand, as we've discussed, I think it would be best to say, look, this middle point right here is like the middle area of the piano where you usually write. But I'm going to list that middle point by telling you what collection of notes we are in and the tonic. That is, to me, the most systematic way to tell people what you're doing, right? You're going to say, I'm in the collection of notes around the C major and the tonic is C. But I could say that I'm in the collection of notes around C major and the tonic is the and the tonic is the Mixolydian, the 5. So you could just say, well, why don't I just call that a G Mixolydian? You could, but notice that means that you have to find the collection of notes from the perspective of the Mixolydian. So it's kind of easier, as with the Nashville numbers typically do in a Nashville number system, to say, this is the collection of notes we're in. Let's do the formula and name the collection of notes from the perspective of the major scale, so you can apply the major formula to figure out the notes in the collection, and then tell you what the tonic is so that you know what the focal point of the song is. That's the perspective or viewpoint of the song. And then you can write the song, once again, from that middle point, whatever the lowest note is in the 12-note collection. In this middle area, that would be like the middle C, middle D, E, and then you can go then I only have to go up here to the next row up when I go to the next octave up from the lowest point that I'm in, right? And then another octave up. Now, it would be nice in a system that you could have multiple rows here. This is why I have multiple rows, so that you could still stack notes if you wanted to. So you should have some option rows available to us, or possibly be able to add rows so I can still stack even though I'm in this condensed type of format in the same octave, or then go up to the next octave. But that's the idea. Now I could write it this way, or I can I could write it this way, giving us the actual notes.